Forget the textbook image, the handsome king, goblet in hand, lute resting on his knee, smiling regally in a crimson robe. When the curtain of history is pulled back, Henry VIII emerges as a living nightmare, his body decaying, his mind warped, and, by the end of his life, this man had transformed into an immense figure who could barely rise from his chair without help. His waist measured a staggering 54 inches larger than the height of some adults, and his bulk hovered around 400 pounds in an era when the average Englishman weighed barely 140. This comparison is not just about size, it's to imagine him sitting on the throne like a mound of flesh. But the real horror was not the weight, it was his legs. They were ravaged by enormous ulcers, some so deep the bone was visible, oozing pus and blood without cease. The stench from these wounds could drift through multiple rooms, forcing anyone approaching him to clamp perfumed cloths to their noses. Servants had to draw lots to decide who would be the unlucky one, tasked with dressing the king a job considered a punishment. In Tudor England, medicine still leaned heavily on ancient humoral theory, with illness attributed to an imbalance of the body's 4 humours. Infected wounds were often lanced to release bad humours rather than disinfected, and foul smells were sometimes interpreted as proof that the sickness was leaving the body. But in Henry's case, the smell never left proof that his body was losing the war. Modern medical historians believe the turning point came in 1536 during a jousting tournament. Henry's horse fell on him, his helmet flew off, and his head struck the ground with brutal force. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, essentially brushing against death in the medical standards of the time. When he awoke, he was not the same man, quicker to rage, suspicious of everyone, and prone to uncontrollable mood swings. The leg wounds that began after this accident became chronic. Some modern experts suspect Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that can cause extreme weight gain, personality changes, and slow healing wounds. This could explain why Henry ballooned to massive proportions while covered in sores that never closed. Yet no physician dared to speak the truth. In Tudor politics, the king's health was a symbol of national strength and divine authority. A weak or ailing monarch was considered an ill omen for the kingdom. To even hint that the king was unwell could be treated as treason, a crime that ended at the executioner's block. The irony is that Henry's body, the very thing he believed proved his might, was betraying him every day. By his final years, even simple movement had become an ordeal. Courtiers placed specially made chairs throughout the palace so he could rest after only a few steps, as each attempt at walking left him sweating, breathless, and sometimes unable to reach a private chamber before an accident occurred. A king who once led armies into battle now relied on attendants to ensure his robes stayed free of what no one dared name aloud. Within the glittering halls of candlelight, music, and feasts, there lingered another scent, persistent, unshakable, a constant reminder that the supreme ruler of England sat atop a body slowly rotting away, and Henry VIII knew it. That awareness would feed the paranoia and cruelty of a mind already fractured by injury, setting the stage for the reign of fear to come. The Henry who had once been a vigorous, charismatic young ruler, the Golden Prince of Europe, was gone. In his place stood a man whose mind seemed to fray a little more each year. Those close to him whispered of sudden rages, wild mood swings, and an ever-deepening suspicion that everyone, from his closest advisors to his own children, was plotting against him. The transformation can be traced to that single catastrophic day in 1536, when his jousting accident not only shattered his body but seemed to jolt his mind loose from its foundations. Medieval accounts describe him as being much altered after the incident, and modern doctors see the hallmarks of traumatic brain injury: impulsiveness, impaired judgment, paranoia, and violent temper. Combine that with constant pain from his ulcerated legs and the fatigue of carrying his immense bulk, and you have a ruler whose decisions were no longer guided by reason, but by instinct and suspicion. In the Tudor court, challenging the king's mental state was unthinkable. Physicians were as much courtiers as healers, their survival depended on flattery, not honesty. To suggest Henry might be ill in mind or body was to risk being charged with treason, and so the king's instability went unchallenged, allowing it to seep into every corner of governance. Henry's paranoia grew into an organizing principle of his rule. Once, he had been a monarch who thrived on public pageantry, mingling with nobles and commoners alike. Now, he became withdrawn, surrounded by layers of guards, screens, and locked doors. His court shifted from a place of political negotiation to a stage for the king's mercurial moods. Those in favour one day could find themselves accused of treachery the next, their fortunes and heads lost in a heartbeat. Every setback, every rumour, became a personal affront to be crushed. Chronic illness, and perhaps Cushing's syndrome, amplified the volatility. Surges of cortisol and hormonal imbalance would have fueled aggression, impaired impulse control, and deepened his conviction that enemies lurked in every shadow. The results were devastating. Ministers who had once steered the ship of state learned to navigate the king's moods instead of the nation's needs. Decisions were made not through counsel and debate, but through fear of what might happen if Henry's temper ignited. The man who claimed divine right to rule now ruled in the name of his own fears. Even small matters could spiral into paranoia. A misplaced word, a delayed letter, or a whispered conversation could be spun into evidence of conspiracy. In this atmosphere, the line between governance and personal vendetta disappeared. The kingdom was an extension of Henry's mind, and as that mind unravelled, so too did the stability of his reign. By the late 1532, this mental decline would manifest in the most intimate arena of royal life, his marriages. The wives of Henry VIII would soon learn that they were not merely partners in a political alliance, but pawns in the unpredictable game of a king who no longer trusted anyone, least of all those closest to him. And when Henry's suspicion fixed itself on them, there would be no escape. The popular version of Henry VIII's marital history is already grim. 6 wives, 2 executed, others discarded or dead. But the truth is far darker. Behind the famous rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, are stories of psychological warfare, humiliation, and fear, so suffocating that death was sometimes the only release. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, knew the peril better than most. At first, she had been the king's obsession, the woman for whom he had broken with Rome, but passion soured into suspicion. When Henry decided he wanted her gone, he didn't simply call for a divorce, he built an elaborate trap. Courtiers and servants were pressured, even tortured, to confess that they had been her lovers. Her own court musician, Mark Smeaton, was beaten into admitting an affair. 5 men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were condemned and executed. Anne was forced to watch their deaths, knowing she was next. This was not just punishment, it was spectacle, a message to the entire realm. The king's will was law, and his paranoia had no limits. Then came Catherine Howard, barely more than a teenager when she married Henry. Bright, pretty, and hopelessly out of her depth, she was a balm to the king's ego for a short time. But when whispers of her past relationships reached him, the reaction was swift and cruel. He not only ordered her execution, but passed a new law, making it treason to marry the king, without disclosing one's entire sexual history, a law clearly designed to shame her, even in death. In the weeks before her beheading, she was kept under constant watch, denied even the comfort of private prayer. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, faced a slower, more methodical cruelty. After refusing to agree to an annulment, she was exiled from court and forbidden to see her daughter, Princess Mary. Henry spread rumours that she was mentally unstable, isolating her until she died alone in 1536. Some historians believe she may have been poisoned, though it could also have been cancer. Either way, she died writing letters to a husband who never read them. Anne of Cleves, famously described by Henry as a Flanders mare, after meeting her in person, fared better than most, but only because she understood the danger. When Henry demanded their marriage be annulled, She agreed without hesitation, even thanking him for the honor of their brief union. The alternative, resisting him, would almost certainly have meant death. Jane Seymour, often called the lucky wife for dying a natural death, didn't escape Henry's coldness either. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's long-desired son, Edward VI. 9 days after her funeral, the king began planning his next marriage. For these women, there was no safe way out. Divorce was the king's prerogative alone. Running away meant immediate execution. Fighting back could bring ruin not only to themselves, but to their families. Each wife lived within a gilded cage, under the constant threat that the man smiling across the table might one day sign her death warrant. And this was not merely the cruelty of a husband, it was the cruelty of a ruler who saw marriage as another theatre of power. The women were not partners, they were symbols to be displayed, traded, or destroyed, depending on the king's needs and mood. Henry's bedchamber was as much a battlefield as any he had fought on, and in it, the casualties were just as real. If you think competitive eating today is outrageous, Henry VIII's dining habits would make even the most gluttonous modern feaster seem restrained. By his later years, the king was consuming an estimated 5,000 calories a day, more than double what a physically active man requires, and Henry was anything but active. His bulk and his infected legs made walking painful, yet his appetite seemed to grow alongside his waistline. A light meal for Henry might include an entire roasted pig, several whole chickens, multiple varieties of fish, mountains of bread, and flagons of wine strong enough to flatten lesser men. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court were the beating heart of this excess, vast, smoky halls where over 200 cooks, bakers, and brewers worked around the clock. Each day, more than 800 different dishes were prepared for the court, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. But it wasn't just about abundance, it was about symbolism. In Tudor England, meat was not just food, it was a marker of class and power. Exotic game like swan, venison, and peacock signalled the king's reach over the land and its bounty. Foreign delicacies, almonds from Spain, sugar from the Mediterranean, spices from the East, spoke to England's trading ambitions and wealth. Henry understood this display well. The more lavish the table, the more untouchable the crown appeared. Then there were the king's peculiar food beliefs. Henry was convinced certain dishes could imbue him with specific virtues: swan for grace, venison for skill in the hunt, oysters for vigour in the marriage bed. These superfoods of the 16th century often appeared in absurd quantities at his table, and yet, beneath the pageantry, there was a constant thread of fear. Poisoning was a genuine risk for monarchs, and Henry's paranoia took it to extremes. Every single dish was first tasted by multiple servants. Then, in an added layer of caution, he insisted those tasters wait half an hour to ensure they did not collapse from slow-acting toxins. Only then would the king touch his food. Meals became theatrical performances, lasting up to 4 hours, with Henry seated in full view of courtiers who watched as he carved, chewed, and drank. The spectacle reinforced his image as a man of means, and might but also hinted at a man imprisoned by his own fears. The kitchens were guarded like fortresses, every ingredient, salt, spices, even water, tested by different officials. His obsession with status even extended to banning certain foods at court, not for health reasons, but because they were too common. Turnips, barley bread, and other staples of the poor were forbidden from the royal table. Ironically, these humble foods might have been far healthier for him than the mountains of rich meats and sugar that were destroying his body. By the end, Henry's feasts were a strange contradiction, both a display of royal grandeur and a private battlefield where his paranoia, vanity, and gluttony played out under candlelight. He believed his kingly status made him immune to the consequences of such indulgence. His body, groaning under the weight of disease and decay, was proof that it did not. By the final decade of Henry VIII's reign, fear was no longer just an undercurrent in the Tudor court, it was its defining feature. The king's paranoia had hardened into a system of rule, and life in his orbit became a constant balancing act between survival and destruction. Henry no longer trusted walls to protect him. He slept with loaded crossbows within arm's reach, and kept daggers hidden beneath his pillows. Guards stood in his chamber through the night, watching him sleep. Every palace was modified to suit his fears. Secret passages threaded through stone corridors, not for romance or convenience, but as escape routes should assassins come. Peepholes were built into walls, so he could spy without being seen. Listening devices, primitive but effective, were hidden in meeting rooms to capture whispered conversations. But perhaps the most chilling element was the web of spies. Henry's intelligence network did not stop at nobles, and foreign ambassadors extended into the kitchens, the stables, even the servants' quarters. And because he trusted no one completely, he ordered his spies to spy on one another. This created a suffocating environment where nobody could be certain who was loyal and who might be reporting their every word. Under such conditions, a misplaced comment or an ill-timed glance could be fatal. People were executed not for what they had done, but for what Henry feared they might do. He accepted dreams, rumours, and anonymous accusations as grounds for arrest. The Tower of London filled with people whose only crime was proximity to the king on a day when his mood turned dark. Even his own blood was not safe. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his daughters, were kept under surveillance, their movements tracked, and their correspondence intercepted. Henry convinced himself they might be plotting against him, children treated as potential enemy agents in their own home. This paranoia infected the entire court. Nobles began denouncing one another to curry favour. Servants betrayed their masters for imagined rewards. People learned to measure their words, to avoid eye contact, to remain silent when spoken to, all in the hope of avoiding suspicion. The king's table, his council chamber, even his bedchamber became stages for a theatre of fear. And just as his body was rotting from within, the political culture of England was decaying under the weight of his mistrust. What had once been a kingdom was now a prison with Henry, as both its ruler and its most trapped inmate, chained not by iron, but by his own mind. By January 1547, Henry VIII was a shadow of the man who had once dominated Europe's stage. His immense body could no longer bear its own weight. Servants hauled him from chamber to chamber in a specially constructed chair, fitted with pulleys and wheels. Wherever he went, the air followed heavy with the sickly sweet stench of decay. His ulcerated legs had grown so foul that chunks of rotting flesh would literally drop to the floor, forcing attendants to follow behind with cloths to clean the royal trail. When death finally came, it was not with dignity. His body, grotesquely swollen from years of disease and indulgence, was stretched tight and shiny, as if the skin itself might split. The smell was so overpowering that even his doctors, men accustomed to the horrors of medieval medicine, had to step outside to vomit. No one wanted to approach closely enough to confirm that the king was truly gone. But the real horror began after death. His corpse was sealed in layers of lead and heavy wooden coffins, the officials believing this would contain the inevitable decomposition. They were wrong. As the funeral procession made its way from London to Windsor Castle, gases from the rotting body built up inside the coffin until, with a grotesque inevitability, it burst. The explosion split the lining and sent a foul seepage spilling onto the floor of the hearse. The stench was so terrible the procession halted so attendants could mop up the remains. Chroniclers of the time recorded an image that still chills the imagination. Dogs licking at the leaked royal fluids on the roadside. Even in burial, Henry's body resisted containment. The grave had to be dug wider than planned to fit the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing under the combined weight of wood, lead, and decaying flesh. It took multiple attempts to lower him in and keep him there. For years afterward, people claimed strange noises and foul smells emanated from his tomb. Some whispered of his restless ghost, Others suggested the more mundane explanation that the corpse of England's most infamous king was still releasing the last of its gases into the crypt. The aftermath was no kinder to those who attended him. Several servants who had handled his body in those final days reportedly died within weeks, possibly from infections contracted during the grim work. It was as though his physical corruption had outlived him, lingering as a final curse on those around him. Henry VIII's legacy is often reduced to the Church of England, his 6 wives, and his political manoeuvrings. But the truer legacy may be this: a man so consumed by fear, excess, and absolute power that he became a prisoner inside his own decaying body, and even death could not end the chaos he brought. In life, he ruled through intimidation. In death, he left behind the memory of a reign where the line between majesty and monstrosity had all but vanished.